Dandavat pranams.
Namaste, Dandavat Pranam. We are here with Kanu Priya Didi, and I'm Krishna Keshava Das, and we're studying G.W.F. Hegel's Aesthetics, his lectures on fine art, in hopes that we can understand something by the grace of Sri Guru and Gauranga, and that, one day, eventually, it may assist in doing service in the form of devotional art. So this is our first class. Did you want to say anything, Didi?
No, probably just feel very happy and fortunate to be able to be here with you.
Likewise. Sripad Bhakti Madhava Puri Maharaj has recommended to read this in regard to learning how does art emerge in the absolute truth. What purpose does it serve in the context of the absolute truth? And of course, the relevance of Hegel's philosophy to devotional life, bhakti yoga, is bona fide as given by Srila Bhakti-Rakshak Sridhar Goswami Maharaj. And we also know, actually, Srila Bhakti Vinod Thakur in his the Bhagavat, his book, the Bhagavat, he specifically compares Srila Vyasadeva. He said Srila Vyasadeva saw the truth from the highest peak on the east, and from the highest peak at the west, Plato saw the truth. And actually, Hegel is coming in essentially the parampara of Plato. Aristotle was a disciple, direct disciple of Plato, and then Hegel came, like 2,000 years later, but he is drawing directly from the teachings of Aristotle and Plato, and his conception has been confirmed as being it corresponds to what Veda is teaching, to what Bhakti is teaching. Srila Sridhar Maharaj has given us that. So it turns out that these ideas are very helpful for the scientific Sankirtan service, which Srila A.C. Bhakti Vedanta Swami Prabhupada has given to Sripad Puri Maharaj, and by extension also Srila Bhakti Niskam Shanta Maharaj, Srila Bhakti Vigyan Muni Maharaj, and I'm also trying to humbly assist in any small way that I can, and trying to understand how art fits into that is relevant, and only by Krishna's grace can we see how that's possible and possibly do something one day.
Yes.
So I guess we'll start here from the translator's preface. Hegel's lectures on aesthetics have long been regarded as the most attractive of all lectures which were published after his death, mainly from transcripts made by members of his audience. Their great strength and interest lies not in their main philosophical and historical thesis, but in what constitutes the bulk of these two volumes, namely the examples and illustrations drawn from India, Persia, Egypt, Greece, and the modern world, and in Hegel's comments in this detail. These comments on art, perhaps especially on painting and literature, must be fascinating to a student of art, however much he may wish to dissent from them. Consequently, although Hegel professes to be lecturing on the philosophy of fine art, and although the lectures have a philosophical background, explicitly expressed here and there, and especially in part one, it is lovers of art and historians of art whom primarily they ought to interest. Professional philosophers already have dry bones of Hegel's philosophy of art in verses 556 through 63 of his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences by Wallace, and in Hegel's philosophy of mind. If a reader finds points labored with tedious prolixity, and if he is annoyed by repetitions, he must remember that he has in front of him something composed mainly from transcripts of lectures, and not something which Hegel had himself prepared for publication. Apart from their philosophical background, the lectures have a historical framework, symbolic, classical, and romantic art, which may be disputable, especially because Hegel says himself that elements of the later forms appear in the earlier, and vice versa. But what is still more difficult is Hegel's main thesis that not only has art a meaning, but that we can now state in plain prose what that meaning is. That art has a meaning and that it reveals something transcending our everyday experience may be granted. But what that meaning and revelation is cannot be expressed otherwise than by the work of art itself. By professing to extract the meaning, Hegel is bound to conclude that art in the last resort is superfluous, as he thinks, romantic art has the doctrines of the Christian religion as its content, then these are known independently of art, and their expression by art is unnecessary. Although Hegel did feel that a new artistic development was heralded in Germany by Goethe and Schiller, this does not seem to have shaken his conviction that art for us is a thing of the past. His attempt towards the end of Volume 1 to show that art is after all necessary may seem weak. He died in 1831, and despite the closing sentence of his introduction, he had no inkling of the wonderful efflorescence of European art in the remainder of the 19th century. If he had written a century later, his pessimism might be more justifiable. These lectures were edited by H.G. Hotto and appeared for the first time in 1835 in 3 volumes of Hegel's collected works. A second and revised edition appeared in 1842. Hotto's materials were some of Hegel's own manuscript notes from his lectures and transcripts of his lectures in 1823, 1826, and 1828 through 29. These Hotto worked into a whole with great skill. He kept as close as possible to Hegel, he says, but his aim was to produce a continuous text, and this means that we cannot be sure in detail whether some of the phraseology is his rather than Hegel's, or whether inconsistencies are due to Hegel's changes of mind after 1823. In 1931, George Lassan began to publish what has to be a completely new edition of the lectures. Owing to his death, the first volume, Die Idee und das Ideal, Leipzig 1931, had no successor. It contains what in this translation is the introduction and part 1. Lassan's desire was to preserve every possible word of Hegel's. He was dissatisfied with what he regarded as Hotto's modifications of Hegel's Ipsissima Verba. His book referred to below and elsewhere as Lassan is based primarily on a reproduction of the 1826 lectures, supplemented occasionally by those of 1823, and frequently by extracts from Hotto's printed edition. It does provide some material which Hotto had admitted, and I have included in footnotes 1 or 2 extracts from it. In the main, however, the impression left on the mind by this book is that Hotto did his work brilliantly. Lassan, page 393, lamented the fact that Glockner had included Hotto's first edition and not the second in his reprint from the collected works. This determined me to make this translation from Hotto's second edition. This edition is scarce, but it has been reprinted by Berlin and Weimar in 2 volumes in 1965, edited by F. Bassinger, who has made some alterations and a truly magnificent index to which I am much indebted. About his text, however, I have some misgivings. He never indicates his departures from the text of Hotto's second edition and sometimes even prints errors in the first edition, although they were corrected in the second. And while he does correct some of the misprints in the second edition, he does not correct them all. For an ample bibliography of editions and translations of these lectures and of studies on them, see Hegel's Studien 5, book by Bonn in 1969, pages 379 through 427. These lectures were first translated by Bernard in 5 volumes in Paris, 1840 through 52. Although he omits some difficult passages, his version is faithful and often illuminating. I am in debt to it. I cannot say so much for the more recent French translation by Jan Kilevich, in 4 volumes, Paris 1944, because while some of the Bernard's omissions are made good, there are fresh ones. The translator resorts too often to paraphrase, and in general his version is too free to be faithful to Hegel. English translations began with W. M. Bryant, who produced New York 1879, a translation, part 2 of the lectures, partly from Bernard's French, and partly from Hotto's second edition. His work is not to be despised. In 1905, Bosanquet published a translation of Hegel's introduction, superseding a partial translation by W. Hastie, 1886. This is a model translation of Hegel, and it has valuable footnotes. A complete English translation was made for the first time by F.P.B. Osmaston, 4 volumes, London, 1816 through 20. My aim has been to supersede Osmaston's version. He seems to me to have made a large number of mistakes and to have been quite unnecessarily verbose. Moreover, there are oddities, e.g. modern Platonists for Neoplatonists. And when Hegel mentions medieval portraits, we do not expect to find them described as portraits of middle-aged men, and we may be surprised to read of Ariosto's Raging Roland or the correspondence of Horace. However, I live in a glass house, and my own version cannot be beyond cavil. If others have paraphrased too much, I may have paraphrased too little, and some may think that I ought to have preserved more of Hotto's italics than I have. Errors I have doubtless made, but I have not omitted anything so far as I know. At times my English may be more Hegelian than felicitous because of my wish to be faithful to Hegel and to be as literal as possible, and where Hegel's enthusiasm leads to mixed metaphors, I have not unmixed them. All the footnotes and everything in square brackets in the text are the translators. There are no notes to speak of in either the German texts or the French translations, but Basenji's index does provide some material to annotation. Osmaston has notes, but all too often they are either unnecessary or wrong or unintelligible. My own notes will come in for criticism. I know that some of them must be amateurish, where the subject matter is beyond the scope of my scholarship. The personal note, audible in a few of them, must be put down to my occasional need for some relief. One critic will complain that there are too many notes, while another will complain there are too few. The former critic must reflect that not everyone can claim, I certainly cannot, to have at his command the range of knowledge evidenced in these lectures. And so, e.g. the notes on Greek and Latin literature, superfluous to a classical scholar, may not be unwelcome to another whose expertise is different. With the latter critic, I have much sympathy, for while I have tried to identify all Hegel's references, some have escaped me. Moreover, what is required, and it is no credit to German scholarship that it has not yet been forthcoming, is annotation to place Hegel's discussion in the context of aesthetic discussions by his contemporaries and immediate seniors, and to identify far more of his allusions to German literature than I have been able to do. Whatever the deficiencies in my notes, they would have been multiplied if I had not had the help of many scholars who have so generously come to my aid. 1 or 2 are mentioned in the notes, but I am especially indebted to Mr. Huntington Cairns, Professors B. Ashmole, A.J. Beatty, C.T. Carr, K.G. Dover, E.H. Gombrich, T.B.L. Webster, W. Witt, and T.E. Wright. My debt is greatest to Professor Witt, not only for notes, but also for help in many passages of the translation. For other passages in Volume 1, I am indebted also to Mr. T.J. Reed of St. John's College, Oxford, who went over several pages with meticulous care and saved me from many mistakes. All errors and failures in the notes and the translation are to be laid to my charge alone. All these scholars are guiltless. Hegel's terminology, however forbidding, is precise and rigid in his later published works, though not here. Those who take the trouble to understand it have little difficulty in following have little difficulty in following thought, but it does create formidable difficulties for a translator. Someday, perhaps, someone who thinks in English will rethink Hegel's philosophy and its terminology and put it all into English. If indeed it be possible to put into language framed by and for empiricism what Hegel calls speculative, i.e., really philosophical thinking. But until that day comes, some attempt must be made to accept and then explain Hegel's terminology and the outlook expressed in it. Therefore, the following notes on A, Hegel's fundamental outlook, and B, some of his terms and their translation, may assist a reader unfamiliar with his work. It is unfortunate that his own introductory passages are so often obscure, because many things mentioned in them are clarified by the examples and illustrations which follow. Hegel's philosophy, Hegel's philosophy is a form of idealism. Terms often used in the translation are italicized here. In this view, what is ultimately real, or in his terminology, what is actual, is the self-knowing spirit. This is not to deny reality to the world in which we live or to ourselves as sensuous beings, but although these are real, they are not taken in and by themselves actual. What is actual is not the real, but the ideal. And Hegel's point might be put in his own paradoxical manner by saying that the ideal is more really real than the real. The ideal is the synthesis of concept and reality, or an art of meaning and shape. This synthesis is what Hegel calls the idea. Now, quoting from Hegel, quoting from somebody, the idea existent in sensible form is the ideal, i.e. beauty, which itself is truth implicit. G.R.G. Muir, The Philosophy of Hegel, London, 1965, page 185. A deformed man is real, but being deformed is not an adequate embodiment or realization or existence of the concept or essential nature of man, and therefore is not actual. Hegel's idea is ultimately derived from the Platonic form or idea, but it differs from Plato's by being a combination of concept with reality. It is not just an ideal, because as Hegel would say, it is not so important as not also to exist. So before we go on, I just want to make one comment about this last paragraph from what I learned from Sripad Puri Maharaj, that a common interpretation of Hegel's philosophy is that it's just idealism, German idealism, which followed Immanuel Kant. But Sripad Puri Maharaj's understanding and many other, well, I don't know about many, but there are a number of other Hegelian scholars who call it absolute idealism or conceptual realism. And Srila Sridhar Maharaj referred to it as ideal realism, because it's not just emphasizing one over the other. It's not idealism or realism, but it incorporates the paradoxical nature, the same kind of nature that Achincha Beta Beta Tattva is emphasizing, that it's not one or many, non-different or different. It's both different and non-different at the same time, that the ideal is real. What's real is the idea, the concept, the consciousness, the content of the consciousness, and also the real itself, what we think is real, is ideal. It is an idea. So like one example that I've talked about with Sripad Puri Maharaj is, you take anything, like that an artist made or an engineer made, anything, like a pencil, for instance, right? You have a pencil in your hand, and most people would call that an object. That's an object. That's the real. And that the idea of the pencil is like how, whatever the pencil would be in your mind. When you think about it, that's the idea of the pencil, but the real pencil is the pencil in your hand. Mm-hmm. So how does that relate to what we're saying here, that it's not either or, it's both at the same time? How would that actually, make sense? And it makes perfect sense, actually, because how did that pencil come to be, right? There was some need for some writing instrument, and, whether it was one person or many people, they thought about what came to be known as a pencil. Somehow it could, press a substance onto paper that would leave a mark, and so all these details were conceived, in consciousness first, because there was some purpose. There was a purpose, and they were trying to meet that purpose, and then the object came after that, right? After, so the idea starts in the consciousness, and it's abstract if it stays there, but then it becomes concrete when the idea manifests in external reality. But it doesn't mean it's no longer an idea. Even if you're holding the pencil, it's not just an object. It's still an idea, but it's in your hand, because, so, so that's helpful, I think. Okay. Yeah. And here, he's saying that the ideal is the synthesis of concept and reality. As I've learned it from Sripad Puri Maharaj, and I've seen Hegel directly say this in places too. The truth is the concept and reality at the same time. So again, when we understand that it's the ideal is the real and the real is ideal, then we're understanding the truth. So I think he might say this in a little different way for some reason, but when we're talking about the concept and its reality together, then it's the truth. So here it's saying that art is, what is actual is not real. And art meaning shape something here. Yeah, so in Hegel's concept here, art is to beauty as truth is to philosophy and love is to religion. That's what Hegel teaches. And these are all, it's a progressive understanding of the absolute, where the idea, where the absolute is expressing itself in art first, because art is dealing with sensuous things in a very immediate way. And then it develops from there as going from very strongly sensuous to more like meditating on that sensuousness and how it relates to consciousness, and then finally seeing the dialectic relation between the two, and again, dialectic is the same idea as achintya bheda bheda tattva. There's simultaneous identity and difference, or unity and difference. Okay. The complete correspondence of concept and reality is not to be found anywhere in nature, or even in human beings, insofar as they are bodies or sensuous beings. This is because things external to one another cannot completely correspond with concepts or categories, which as thoughts form a whole internally interconnected. It is when man's mind has risen to self-consciousness as spirit, that in spirit and its productions, the oppositions between universal, particular, subject and object, ideal and real, divine and human, are ultimately reconciled in a concrete unity. Knowledge and fact may, at the intellectual level of natural science, be opposed to one another as universal to particular. But when the fact known is man's spiritual self, knower and known become a unity in which the difference between the two is not expunged, but retained and mediated or reconciled. It is important to notice that the one essential route to man's knowledge of himself as spirit is through his knowledge of what is other than his true self, i.e., through knowledge and experience of living in what is opposite to him as man, i.e., in nature, or opposite to him as an individual, i.e., ultimately in this state, and through being reflected back into himself out of this opposite or object. Hegel is fond of this metaphor. The eye does not see itself except through its reflection in a mirror. Consciousness becomes aware of itself by being aware of objects and then by being reflected back into itself from them. The background of all this is theological, whatever may be thought of Hegel's theology. At first, God thinks the thoughts or concepts which particularized or given embodiment or shape are nature and man. And coming to know these concepts, man comes to know his own essence, and so to consciousness of himself as self-conscious and self-knowing spirit. This is at the same time a consciousness of being united with God in a concrete unity, not vanished in him as happens, according to Hegel's interpretations, in some Eastern religions. Yeah, that's nice. Basically, he's talking against Mayavad philosophy. Yeah, just recognizing that the difference is real. It's a unity in difference, not just a pure unity. To consider the relationship between God and the souls as a pure unity, where the difference between God and the souls, the finite souls, is terminated. That is just very abstract idea.
Where it spoke about the nature, the man's nature, when one realizes that.
Yeah, that was it was. Yeah.
Oh, I think it was further down. I don't think it was just you just spoke about natural. No, maybe it was up there.
It was the sentence that goes here. This is because things external to one another can. Okay, it is when man's mind has risen to self-consciousness as spirit that in spirit and its productions, the oppositions between universal and particular, subject and object, ideal and real, divine and human, are ultimately reconciled in a concrete unity. Is that?
No, I'm trying to find, you're reading and I'm listening and taking notes at the same time. I've read this before, but it's good to, it's been a while.
Here,
here, this bit here, yes. So, yeah, important to note it. Yeah, that bit. Essential route to man's knowledge of himself as spirit is through his knowledge of what is other than his true self, i.e., through knowledge and experience of living in what is opposite to him as man, i.e., in nature, or opposite to him as an individual, i.e., ultimately in the state, and through being reflected back into himself without out of this opposite or object. So I mean, essentially, would you say that's like, I mean, just trying to think of that in terms of our teachings and how we're to understand that in our teachings, like in the nature of man, the opposite. I'm just thinking, that which is not of God almost. So how are we to understand, the human nature and the like anger, greed, lust, all these things. Would you say it's like we could interpret it in that way, to know what is not God, or to understanding that which is not of God?
It's talking about the finite souls, specifically in the human form of life, the finite soul and the human form of life. So from obviously Veda, all living entities are finite soul, and there's the finite soul is experiencing subjective evolution of consciousness from its past activities and its nature. And when it has the opportunity to experience a human form of life, it's able to really engage in deeper thought that's beyond right, living, mating, defending, and sleeping. It's actually able to contemplate its own spiritual nature, right? It is the first verse of Vedanta Sutras, Tato Brahma Jigyasa. Now, therefore, inquire about spirit, where they say now means a couple of things. I believe there's now means now that you're in the human form of life, you can comprehend your spiritual nature, or now, I think Srila Jiva Goswami said, now that you're in the association of a devotee, you can inquire into your spiritual nature. So this is saying for man, for humankind, in order for them to know their spiritual nature, it is only through knowledge of what is other than themselves. The first thing that this brought to mind was just is something that modern psychology recognizes. I learned this from Sripad Puri Maharaj also, that that in order to recognize yourself as alive, like, you know, when a child is developing, they reach this age of reason, it's called, and it's you know, they're like 5 years old, 6 years old, or something like that. But in order to actually recognize that they are subjective, that they're not just another object in a room full of other objects, that only happens when they encounter another living creature, a person. When they see the behavior and actions of another living entity, then the child at the age of reason can understand that, oh, I'm also different from this chair or all these objective just objects. I'm living. So that's one thing where they just recognize, or that we all have been through already, where we just recognize that we're living and that we're conscious, and that is very distinct from many of the objects in our environment. But then obviously further than that, because that's still within, for Hegel, that's in nature. Nature is a stage when spirit doesn't recognize that, when spirit is trying to come back to it, is recognizing that it's spirit. Spirit doesn't realize that at first, so it goes through the logic and then through nature and then finally back to itself as self-conscious spirit. So what I just explained there is still a natural experience where the human being doesn't know that they are a soul, but they're just coming to the realization that I'm not just an object, I'm alive and I'm conscious. So then the second layer would be learning about the soul. You know, that's where Veda comes in, and not only Veda, Hegel deals with that. That's part of the development of his encyclopedia of philosophical sciences, and you know, that's a part of what we're studying here, how he actually gets to that, because that's what's so fascinating, that he actually reaches, you know, Srila Sridhar Maharaj confirmed that he reaches the Gaudiya Siddhanta up until Rasa. Rasa is not addressed in Hegel's philosophy, but he gets up to the Gaudiya Siddhanta of Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva. And and he does it in a systematic reason, step by step, where one step is connected to the previous through a necessary transition. Necessary, you know, means that it's not just some you know, it's not just some kind of okay, let's talk about this now. It's not random, it's necessary. It emerges. Necessary means that the new emerges out of the previous. You know, it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's coming to mind is, you know, when the verse in the Gita, and I can't remember it, but where it's saying, you know, that where someone either comes through suffering, or someone comes because, you know, they want something, or they, you know, so this is sort of like, you could say, it's on sort of like a material level almost, you know, related to one's environment, related to one's external self, where we're suffering, that we're realizing that there must be something more than this. So I'm just thinking in terms of that way, that the soul has a realization that there's more than this, when it's almost like it's had enough of, or it's kind of having some sort of belief or knowledge or experience, because I suppose in that sense that we are thinking, feeling and willing. So there's that, which, so I'm just thinking in terms of like the material nature, or the exploited, that plane of exploitation, which is so far away from true self.
Yes, I see what you're saying.
So that's what I was just thinking, that maybe
this part. Through knowledge and experience of living in what is opposite to him as man in nature, or opposite to him as an individual, and through being reflected back into him out of this opposite or object. Yeah. So as far as, okay, I'm in nature and I'm trying to essentially do things to derive satisfaction, and I'm trying so many things and it's not working. So what's going on? I have to, what am I? Yeah. So that actually, right, that comes back to Srila Sanatana Goswami's question to Mahaprabhu. He says, he asks, Kayami means who am I? Sanatana Goswami asks, he says, who am I? And then he says, and why am I suffering the threefold miseries?
Yeah.
And then Mahaprabhu tells him, you are simultaneously one and different with the absolute truth. And, you are Krishna or Nitya Das, an eternal servant of Krishna, spirit. So anyhow.
Which then would relate to what I was saying early in the previous paragraph, where it talks about being almost like in alignment with the Lord, not exactly like that, but it was sort of mentioned that knower and known becoming a unity, if you see what I mean.
Knower and known becoming a unity. Yes, no doubt. Maharaj, Sripatpa Maharaj talks about this a lot, about knower and knowing becoming unity, where I would have to ask him to possibly elaborate on this again, but he talks about this, how you have to see how, it's not just that the subject and the object are at ends with each other, but the subject is in the object and the object is in the subject.
Yes. But it's coming to that realization, isn't it? It's because when you don't realize that, and when you don't know that, and you have no knowledge of that, you're going around in this cycle of
suffering. Samsara.
So when you come to that realization, at whatever point, where Krishna's saying, some people come because of this, or some people come because of that, but essentially they're going to eventually, in their own way or their own journey, hopefully come to that point of questioning, like you're saying, questioning, okay, what is this? I'm more than this. There's more than this. What is it about? And then I guess that's when the journey can start taking place, where we can start then to look at oneself.
Yeah, it's going to be real nice to see how art helps to facilitate that, because I think that's what this will be getting at. How does art help to serve as a catalyst for that kind of reflection and catalyze spiritual life?
Yeah. It's an interesting one, because there's so many different ways of doing it. Art is so in a sense, like different people like different things for different reasons, and they're attracted in different ways. Like beauty is a real interesting dynamic. And I think in its truest sense, you know, beauty is the truth. And essentially that's what we're all searching for, but we don't realize it. Again, it's that comes back to that same thing where we're separate from. Every time we're separate from, you know, we're searching in the wrong place. So how do we come to the realization of searching in the right place to get the real beauty? And how can art facilitate that in a sense? I don't know if I'm making sense. It, you know, I
Shall
think
we
it's, yeah,
continue on?
yeah, if you want to. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot in that, in what you've just read, there. There's a hell of a lot already
Yeah.
in just that, you know. And how do you get someone to the first stage or that first point of realization? Because ultimately, it's about developing someone's consciousness
Yeah.
into thinking more deeply about, you know, just sense enjoying. Because most people, it's all about sense enjoying, you know. Even when they go to art galleries, it's all they like this one or they like that one. They don't even necessarily know why, or they, you know,
Hey,
just
people aren't going to the art museum to become a better person.
no, they're certainly not. They're just going to, you know, again, it's all about enjoyment. And
Yeah.
some people aren't even creative, but some people, for some reason, they like, you know, they're attracted, you know, to the colors or the shapes or
Yeah.
visual, like you're saying, visual, that sensory thing of looking at something that's beautiful. To think that also that someone's painted that or done that is for some people that aren't creative is amazing. You know, like I might think of someone that is a mathematician or can do, you know, really, I don't know, there's many things. I might think, wow, that's incredible because it's outside of my nature of understanding.
Hmm.
So how can art work in how can art uh, uh, get people to, you know, think, and which I think a lot of art does, you know, it's like you're saying, there's different types of art, you know, symbolic art, classical art, romantic art, and in a way, again, it's sort of reaching out to different types of people in that sense, whether how they're attracted to things. So people, it's like reading something, you know. Artwork can be like like even with iconography, they don't call it painting, they call it writing, because it's a visual again, it's visual. You read it, you read the painting, and it's I suppose because it's supposed to be from another realm, it's supposed to transcend the material world. It's not like just a picture or just a pretty picture. So again, it's all kind of like education and getting people to think. So it'd be interesting to explore ways of doing that.
Yeah.
I'm just doing it. There's a small. I joined this interfaith group and of artists, and we've got a small exhibition in November. So I'm just working on doing a painting. It's what's called a chinoiserie, which is sort of flowers and birds. But I'm going to paint the two, you know, and represent Paramatma and the Jivatma,
Hmm.
like the two birds.
Nice. Yeah.
So, and then put some explanation to that. So, I suppose these are just simple ways, but it would be nice in other ways on how to progress this project with Hegel and Hegel's interpretations, and how we link that to Vedanta.
Well, I know one aspect that Sripad Puri Maharaj has said um, about these visual illusions, right? People create you see them all over the web, all over the internet, and there's more complex ones. You know, the shadow art where people make a structure that doesn't really look like anything, and then you shine the light against the wall with the thing in front of the light, and then the shadow is like a very clear picture or something like that. But so I guess that's not really a visual illusion. But Sripad Puri Maharaj is one of his ideas is that these visual illusions show how defective the senses are. So for people who have a lot of faith in sense knowledge, you can, you know, this creatively show how, look, you know, you're not, this isn't the way to gain knowledge of reality.
Absolutely. But it's again getting them to understand, because I think there's lots of art like that, like even, you know, Bridget Riley and people like that have done even just like simple lines, and you've got a flat piece of paper, and when you draw the lines in a certain way, it looks like it's bumpy, or you know, looks like it's going down a tunnel, or it even looks like it's moving, you know. Looks like circles moving around. So, and it's just illusionary. And like you were saying about the shadow thing, you know, someone can put sort of like a sculpture together, and it just looks like a lump of metal, and then when you shine a light on it on the wall, it's the face, or you know, landscape. It's incredible how these, you know, that can artists can do those sorts of things, and it's incredible art that can be made. Even you think of the tiny miniature things, even like on a pencil, you know, the tip of a pencil, people are you know, creating amazing sculptures, and you just think, wow, that's, you know, so amazing things. But I suppose essentially is getting people to understand that the senses aren't accurate, and that we, you know, we think we're right, or we think we know, and we don't. But then how do you get them to start to understand also the truth?
Well, that's a part of Hegel's system, is what is the transition from art to religion, and then from religion to philosophy. So as we go along with this, like we were saying before, how his system, it moves from one step to the next step through the necessity. So I don't know what that is, you know, because I haven't studied this either. I'm very happy we're doing this together here. We'll hopefully be able to see what is that, what is the necessity from which religion comes out of the sensuous expression of the absolute as art. So how does beauty, sensuous expression of the absolute as art, beauty, how does that necessarily then make the step to religion a more internal transition of beauty to love? Because like we said before, what beauty is to art is what love is to religion, and what truth is to philosophy or science. So how does beauty transition to love? No, I don't know. But I think we'll read something about it here. And, you know, I don't know how much people have studied these things. So that's why it may be very useful to people who are artists, philosophers, so many things, to just not only encourage their own study of these, but doing it ourselves and just being transparent about what we're thinking.
It's very fascinating. It's an interesting, very interesting project to work on.
So I guess we've been at this for almost an hour. Do you want to keep going, or do you want to stop for today?
Maybe we could stop for today and then just schedule again. I mean, I'm happy for this Thursday evening's fine, about that time. 7 o'clock, 7 and 7:30.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll refresh myself, because I had the book on audio, so I've already listened to it, but I can listen. I'll try and listen to it again, and then we can read. Carry on. Be nice.
Yes, I have no exposure to this yet, so this is all new for me.
Right.
Well, I mean, exposure to this specific book, but I know that Hegel talks about this also in his Encyclopedia of Spirit at the very end of his philosophical system. So I don't know how this will compare to what he says there. But anyhow, by Krishna's grace, we're just trying to expose ourselves to these things, with the permission and grace of the Guru and Gauranga. So anyhow, Dhanava Pranam, Didi.
Dandavat pranams. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do my Dandavat pranams to Maharaj.
Sure.
Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.